Hey, hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Doom Wizard. Today's May 14th, 2023. In today's video, I'd like to read an article written in Grist by Jake Biddle 2 days ago. The title is, "What Does Climate Change Have to Do with the Debt Ceiling Crisis?" The subhead is, "A barrage of climate disasters have slowed down federal tax collections just when it's needed most." We can talk a little bit about this after, but I'm going to read from the top. As President Joe Biden tangles with Republican lawmakers whether to raise the nation's debt ceiling, a key question looms over the negotiations. When exactly will the U.S. government run out of money? No one knows the answer, but one factor is making it harder to pin down: climate change. A barrage of climate-fueled disasters has slowed down the pace of federal collection, pushing the government closer to an unprecedented default on its debt this summer. There are countless factors that determine how much tax revenue the federal government receives on any given day, but one major factor this year is climate change. The past year saw more than a dozen billion-dollar disasters, and as many states and the Internal Revenue Service has offered tax relief to residents of these states, giving them a few extra months to file their taxes. The worst affected states include Florida and California, which suffered respectively from Hurricane Ian and a series of atmospheric rivers storms this winter. Together, the two states account for more than a quarter of the federal revenues. Because millions of taxpayers have been able to delay their filings due to disasters, the federal government is receiving less money than it otherwise would at this time of year. In ordinary circumstances, this wouldn't be a problem since the government borrows money to make up for uneven balance between tax revenue and spending, usually by issuing bonds. But because the U.S. has reached its self-imposed debt ceiling, an arbitrary limit on how much that borrowing the government can do, the fate of the global economy depends on how much cash the Treasury receives over the next few weeks. The limit was established around a century ago, and Congress has raised it dozens of times, typically without controversy. But in recent years, Republicans have seized on debt ceiling authorization as high-stakes way to extract concessions that they don't have to vote to pass through Congress. Since assuming the control of the House of Representatives this year, Republicans have refused to endorse the customary debt ceiling increase unless Biden agrees on cuts in federal spending that have already been appropriated by Congress. Though the exact conditions that will satisfy enough Republicans to vote for an increase are unclear, a variety of controversial options are on the table, including a repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate law intended to keep the U.S. in line with the Paris Agreement targets. The U.S. reached the current debt limit in January. Since then, the Treasury Department has been paying daily bills using only the cash it has on hand. If lawmakers don't raise the debt ceiling soon, the Treasury will run out of cash and have no choice but to default on its debt. This would have disastrous and unprecedented consequences. Veterans and Social Security recipients would miss payments, borrowing costs for credit cards and mortgages could jump, and global financial markets would enter a tailspin. Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy met this week to discuss a debt ceiling increase, but a big problem for both sides is that no one knows for sure when the Treasury will run out of cash. Treasury officials have said that a default could arrive as early as June 1st, but the federal government is so large that it's impossible to predict how much money it will receive from taxes on any given day. The best that officials can do is give a ballpark estimate of when the so-called X date of default will arrive. Federal disaster declarations have made the prediction even more difficult. Quote, "The disaster declarations are playing a heightened role in determining the X date because they are shifting normal revenue patterns of government and spreading them across the year as opposed to truncating them into a tax season," says Rachel Snyderman, a senior associate director at economic policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a nonprofit think tank that has been studying the debt ceiling on timeline. If lawmakers had started negotiating a debt limit increase earlier in the year, Snyderman said, this uncertainty wouldn't be a big deal. But the X date now potentially just weeks away, the ups and downs of federal tax revenue collection have become extremely important. A few extra days of revenue can mean the difference between a safe resolution and a chaotic default. If government can make it to June 15th without running out of money, it will receive a large chunk of cash from quarterly tax filings, which should stabilize revenue for a few weeks. Then at the end of June, the Treasury will be able to access another $143 billion in borrowing authority, which could help stave off default until the beginning of August. But if May tax revenue remains lower than projected, the government will never reach the mid-June revenue influx at all. Without the debt limit increase, an X date is inevitable, but the revenue delays could push the date earlier and earlier, hiding the risk of default. Shifting a breach date a few days one way or the other is important this close to the finish line, said John Bull, a spokesperson for the Tax Policy Center, though they are hardly the biggest factor in the debt ceiling crisis. This is why the disaster delays matter. By failing to raise the debt limit, Congress has made the government invulnerable to every little tax revenue bump in tax revenue, and climate change has created quite a few bumps. That's the end of that article. So what we've gathered here is that climate change and its effects are already here, and they are clearly a threat, pushing our tax deadlines around and ultimately undermining the security of the United States. This was also outlined by the Director of National Intelligence in a testimony to Congress but a month ago. So if this isn't a bad omen of things to come, then I don't know what is. I'll talk to you soon.